Okay, welcome back, everyone, to part two of this week's lecture on the demography of the modern world. And as we noted in the first lecture, and I'm going to try and draw links between the two, the demography is not just about the size and structure of populations, but also the movement of populations over space and time. And again, that's going to be very useful for analyses of sort of social, cultural, and political trends, both back in history, but also in the present, and also then obviously to the future. So we're going to deal with two themes here. One are going to be the Great Migrations over the last 4 to 5 centuries. People have been on the move much more, not that they weren't on the move before, but much more in the modern period, both across continents, across oceans, but also within societies and within regions, largely, as we'll deal with in the second half, from rural to urban areas, and the ways in which urbanization has really become a feature of the modern world. And again, we talked a little bit about that in terms of agriculture largely being subsistence agriculture, largely being the predominant economic activity prior to 1700, and then the shift from the farm into cities, towns, and industry and other occupations. Okay. So again, going back to the last lecture, we saw this slide generally, right? The distribution of world population by region. We noted in the last lecture that Asia has largely accounted for 60% of the global's population for a very, very long time. But as we can see, the other regions have kind of shifted. And so certainly the ones to highlight here are obviously South America and North America, right? Grew from very tiny populations to compose now somewhere probably between 7 to 10% of the global population. We look at Europe as well and the ways in which it expanded over this period and was growing over this period, but the ways in which it is shrinking today and why that's the case, and what might it portend for the future. And then the last one, obviously, we're going to talk a little bit more about in terms of is Africa. And again, looking at the largely stable proportion, right? It's one of the regions that is not growing until the modern period. And again, Dr. Oliveira in her lecture from last week talked about how Africa now has one of the youngest populations in the world. Okay. So again, another way of looking at this, I don't want to belabor a lot of these numbers. I'll leave them up on the screen for a minute, but you'll have the PowerPoint to go into a little bit more detail here. But again, is to think about these kind of fluctuations. As we can see, right, largely Asia has accounted for near as much as almost nearly 2/3 of the global population. A decline in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then back to around about 60%, although for the future, right, somewhat of a decline, right? Europe, again, growing in the 19th century, despite the fact, right, that we know that many Europeans, as we'll see in a minute, are leaving for other parts of the globe, primarily North America and South America. But as we can see, shrinking, right, from a height at the turn of the 20th century to the turn of the to nearly almost nearly halved by the turn of this century, and again further declines into the 21st centuries. And again, looking at the Americas, fewer than 2% of the global population in 1700 to as high as almost 14% by the 1950s, and again fueled by immigration, but also fueled by what we're going to call sort of natural increase. The wealth of these societies enabled them to produce, right, and to have mortality decline, but also to be able to produce more and more healthy children who went on to have families of their own. And then Africa, right? Again, thinking about, we're going to talk about this in a minute, the impact of things like the slave trade and of colonization, right? Africa, as we can see here, declines over this period and really doesn't recover until after 1950, and then looks to be the leader, right, in terms of the growth of global population by far into the 21st century. And so again, what does that mean for the future? How does it explain some of the things that are going on in present day Africa? Okay, so we're going to talk generally about 4 periods of major migration. One before the 1800s, and I'm going to emphasize here that this is mostly unfree populations. People are being kind of forced to move, right? They're being transported or forced out for the most part. It's really not until the 1820s or 1830s when migration across international boundaries, and particularly transatlantic migration, really becomes dominated by peoples who are free or mostly free, and we'll make those kind of distinctions in the next slide. And part of that is a mindset change, right? In the sense that, and this happens again primarily in British society. Scholar James Belich has looked at the ways in which these kind of settler dominions in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, elsewhere, but also you could claim the United States as well, had a shift towards seeing, people being, in the early period, basically only those at the very, very lower stratum of the socioeconomic scale went to the colonies. When we think about Australia, right, it was a convict colony. But after 1820, there was this notion of kind of moving out and expanding the empire, but this is being driven by people who want to move, who want to expand, who want to increase their opportunities and all those other kinds of things. And so there's also kind of a cultural shift as well that's going on through there. Then again, between 1830 and 1914, and we think of the great waves of immigration that come to Canada and the United States in that period in particular, but also places like in South America, like Argentina. Buenos Aires becomes a huge settlement for Italians, right, and becomes the third large, and Spanish as well becomes the third largest Spanish-speaking city in the world. So, and then again, 1950 to 1990, and we think again the kind of after the Second World War and more people on the move. And people coming to, again, Canada, the United States, and elsewhere, but also moving in and around Europe. And then certainly from 1990 onwards. We should also think about movements, and again, we're going to talk about this more in the second half, but also movements within regions. So this is going to be important. So particularly as we look at that map there, the growth of the Russian Empire. But we also think about this in terms again of North America, the kind of settling of the Canadian and American West, right? So there's movements within regions that are going to be extremely important. And as we'll see by the time we get to the late 20th century and early 21st century, internal movements of populations, both from rural areas to cities, is going to be extremely important, but even within continents and within those other kinds of sub-regions of the world. Okay, first migration, right, largely occurs in the 1600s, largely is a movement to, we think of the big one is the movement of European peoples to the Americas over this period. Particularly, again, we think of the British colonies and others in the Caribbean and in the United States, and what would become Canada. And the majority of the people who are arriving in the New World prior to the 19th century are to varying degrees what we would call unfree. For whites, this usually meant indentured labor, and that was those who were bound to labor contracts to pay their passage. So maybe 5 to 7 years, and then at the end of that, they were free to go. They're free to return home if they wanted to, or they were, or they could, set up their own farm or whatever else business, and they could, and they would stay. And so some left, and some stayed. For African peoples, for those who are Black, slavery increasingly became a system over this period. It wasn't necessarily at the beginning, but it certainly was by the mid and the end points of it, a system by which they were bound to labor for someone else, forced labor, for the rest of their lives, and to which a condition, that same condition, was heritable by their children. So any children produced by slaves then became slaves themselves. And I think the chart above shows the kind of voracious appetite for the sugar and tobacco and eventually cotton and coffee and all those other kinds of things, these cash crops of the New World, which were feeding economic development in Europe, that it reveals, right? And particularly among African peoples in this period. But you can see the ways in which, look at the numbers of even Europeans who arrived, particularly in the West Indies. And again, the South was the magnet for most of the population in this period. That's where the money was to be made. That's where the opportunity was to be made. But things like malaria, yellow fever, all of those kinds of things had a devastating impact on European populations, and largely then required, including, if we think about the other devastating impact of disease upon indigenous peoples of those regions, the Caribbean, South America, North America, required new sources of labor. And this was the reason in many ways for African slavery, is that whites and indigenous peoples of the Americas could not survive in those conditions. Now, neither did many slaves, other that they were worked to death, but that there became this this necessity, right, for labor. Okay. If we look at, and this is a chart from American history, from which I'm most familiar with, look at the mid-Atlantic states. So we're talking about like New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and then the New England states, so Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York. Very few Europeans arrived, but and even fewer Africans, right? Their economies were not established for kind of cash crop, labor-intensive cash crop agriculture. Part of it's the environment, the climate, and all the rest of that. But look at the numbers of Europeans who arrive, and it's the only region that has more people left at the end of that period than who originally arrived. And so this is natural increase, right? This is about these new societies that were created, these new settler societies, these neo-Europes, which then transferred, crops and all kinds of other things to the quote unquote New World, who were able to reproduce their societies to double in the spaces of 20 and 30 years, which was unheard of in this period. Again, largely due to things like virgin soils, but again, resistance to diseases and that didn't necessarily exist. The North was not, those who came to the Massachusetts colony were generally not going to die of malaria or all sorts of other yellow fevers or other things that plagued southern and West Indies societies in that period. Okay, and so southern colonies could not be sustained without a constant stream of migrants, and usually, as I said, in this period, slaves. And so until the 1820s, 80% of the people arriving in the Americas were African peoples. Okay, so that's something to note here. It's really, really, really important. Okay, and then what does the impact then have on other regions of the world? Well, the 20 million Africans that are taken from the continent means that there were fewer Africans around. Right. And so if there's fewer of them around, then there's fewer of them to reproduce and create and to grow those societies. Labor, as well, as being taken out of these economies and these societies and delivered to elsewhere in the world. It also creates huge rivalries and conflicts, both not just between Europeans and Africans. Europeans and Africans largely lined up along the coast there had come to agreements, right? That they would be supplied with slaves, and in return, They would receive European goods and other things. And so, but it created conflict between and within African societies to feed that voracious demand for slave labor. Okay. And so basically by 1800, and we can see, if we think about that chart I showed you earlier, the population of Africa was probably only about half of what it should have been, had all of those Africans remained on the continent and not been captured and sold into slavery. And that economic disruption has been shown by historians and economists and others to still have tremendous disruptive impacts down to today. And you look at the map here, and the societies where slavery, right, was the slave trade took place. If we look at the chart on the right there, high export slave countries, their GDP down to today remains very small and largely flat, as opposed to low slave export countries, those appearing on white in the map, where societies, where modern African societies are growing. And again, Dr. Oliveira talked a little bit about some of the growing economies in Africa over the last 30 to 40 years. And again, a lot of this is linked to the impact of slavery. And again, slavery disrupted all of these societies through warfare. It created destabilized societies and resulted in weak and fragmented states, which then made them ripe for that scramble for Africa in the late 19th century and the kind of colonial domination by others until the 1950s. But it even exists down to today when we think of the kind of civil and other conflicts that have gone on in Africa between and within groups and all kinds of other things that a lot of this goes back to the fact that those societies were permanently or certainly irrevocably affected by the capture and sale of Africans into the slave trade. And others have even looked at the ways in which this can, again, skew sex ratios, leading to greater polygamy in many African societies, which in the modern period has had an impact on the spread of AIDS throughout Africa, where, really in the last, over the last few decades, the AIDS crisis was critical, absolutely critical in Africa. And again, has been another break on the African populations and African economic growth and political stability. Okay. Other things I want to talk about here is not just issues around race or around class, but also look at gender as well. And this is one theme that I want to point out here. We think of slavery in most cases as coming to the New World, and certainly those who are laboring under such forceful conditions on sugar plantations and others. We think of them as mostly male, right? But again, women were often prized as slaves because of their reproductive capabilities, right? If your children become slaves, then it was a way of increasing the number of slaves you had on a plantation that you controlled, and you did not necessarily have to purchase or import others. But also other reproductive activities on plantations that were necessary, cooking and all those other kinds of things. But women also worked in the fields as well. We shouldn't oversee that element of it as well. Again, I want to emphasize here that women working has always been a central part of history. It's not a modern phenomenon, right? What women do when they go to work or when they're at work has changed over time, but women have always been central to the success of all economies, family economies, national economies, regional economies, and global economies. Women also, in many ways, bore a differential physical brunt of captivity, particularly issues around sexual violence and rape. But women were also carriers of tradition as well, languages, but also the spread of things like the ideas around inoculation to things like smallpox and other diseases that we talked about in the first lecture. Okay. The 19th century. And the 19th century, so this is the sort of second phase. The 19th century and 19th century migration systems are critical. This is the century of migration. And even though we think about down to today the ways in which migration and refugee issues and all of those other kinds of things, kind of show up in our news feeds and our social media feeds and on the TV, really it's the 19th century that is the largest and most important. And again, 19th century makes sense. The development of transportation systems and all kinds of other things that would enable, right, from steamships, railroads, all kinds of other things, the movement of people and the reliable movement of people across national, international, and transoceanic boundaries. Okay. And again, we look at this and we think of the modern period, and we think sometimes in Canadian politics and things like that, or even in American politics that we get a lot of feeds on, right? This arrival of all of these people, this immigration is a big issue. And yes, it is a big issue, but the numbers that arrive and that are on the move in the 19th century far outweigh and far exceed those of the modern period. Now, again, many of them move to rural areas. Again, this is the settlement of the Canadian West and the American West, but also into, even in China, internal migrations, expanding the Qing dynasty, or again, Russia stepping out into places like Kazakhstan and Siberia. By the turn of the 20th century, again, most of that then was urban and industrial, coming to feed the factories and the cities to build the sort of modern economies of the modern world. Good chunk of this is also being transported across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So Indians and Asian peoples, Chinese peoples, are being are moving not only within Asia but across the Pacific to places like North America and South America, largely in the aftermath of slavery. Right, there's still this tremendous demand for labor in many of these economies, and despite the end of slavery. And so again, this kind of sort of semi-free, what was called coolie labor, which was imported in places like the Caribbean, South America, and elsewhere, to take over from slaves. And again, many of these kind of existed in this kind of liminal space between freedom and unfreedom. They weren't slaves, but they weren't particularly free to come and go either in that sense. Again, we talked about sort of internal resettlement of Russia and of China. And again, the other important thing to think about here as well, right, is, not just the reasons for a lot of this movement, but if we think about the kind of expansion of China, the expansion of Russia, it also came at the expense of those who are already living in many of those territories, indigenous peoples and the original inhabitants. So in China, certainly things like the Dzungars met largely with the same fate as did indigenous peoples in the Americas did from the expansion of European peoples into the New World. And so the displacement, the replacement, both in terms of numbers, but cultural and all kinds of other things that's going on, is not just kind of a European phenomenon. Settler colonialism has Asian and other roots. Okay. Again, when we think about this period, and we're going to go back to talking about the kind of gendered implications of this, again, we largely think of immigrants largely as men, largely coming over to work in the factories, to take over farms, all of those other kinds of things. And if women come along, they largely come along as wives and daughters, right, to support their husbands. But, and that's true to a certain degree, but certainly in this period, women are being recruited specifically, or being sent from societies, and this is true down to the modern day, to work in factories and all kinds of other things as well. And some of them are specifically recruited for the types of jobs that we're doing it. And if we think about the key areas of the kind of industrial revolution, particularly the first industrial revolution, textiles, food manufacture, things like that, that depended heavily upon women's labor. Okay, so women were going to be important and continue to be important, as we'll see on this next slide. Again, women's roles in global migration chains largely follow similar patterns. And women, today, as we see that chart, make up at least 44, 45%, sometimes over 50% of global migration flows. And again, similar, some of this is about family formation, but a good chunk is for labor in the manufacturing and the service economies, right? And many women, in many cases, are not only choosing to leave for quote unquote economic opportunities elsewhere, but many of them are being forced to leave because of poverty and all kinds of other things. And they're forced to leave family and children behind. And we may want to think about those who arrive in Canada and the United States to become nannies or personal support workers in hospitals and things like that, who are pursuing economic opportunities so that their families can put food on the table and enjoy the niceties of life back home. And so women's remittances, that is, money that they earn in these new societies that they've migrated to and then sent back to their home or home societies, is huge. And it represents more than 50% of the total of all remittances of global transfers currently going on in the global economy. And this is despite the fact that we know that in many of those industries, right, women's wages and working conditions are significantly lower. So this does have gendered impacts and implications. The other thing that we should think about here as well is the impact that it has on the kind of receiving societies, or how receiving societies deal with issues around migration and immigration. And so, like I said, in Canada, the United States, we bring in women from places like the Philippines and elsewhere to become, or the Caribbean or elsewhere, to become personal support workers in our hospitals, to look after aged peoples in long-term care homes or nannies or things like that. But that's largely because our societies are fairly open to immigration, right? And so we've adopted this strategy to deal with our own demographic transitions, right? As our population ages, right? And who's going to look after them, and how are we going to deal with the costs of all of that, and things like that. Japan, on the other hand, as we know, has traditionally been reluctant to allow outsiders into its society, right? It's only quote unquote opened up after the 1850s. But it has been sort of more hostile to bringing in immigrants. And so Japan's way of dealing with an aging society, which is again far more, the age structure is far more skewed to the elderly in Japan than it is in Canada and the United States. And again, this may be due to the fact that they're not bringing in immigrants, right? Is the use of artificial intelligence, robots, automation to look after the elderly within their society. Okay. And then if we look sort of more towards the modern period, what's been going on perhaps since the 1990s, and as you can see, there's still global flows of people across continents, across oceans in this period. But as you can see, in particular, there's a lot of internal migrations. And we want to, and I'll show this certainly in terms of Europe in a slide in just a minute. So particular areas of the world tend to be sending, as again, mostly Asia, but also Latin America. And we think of Latin America in the 19th century as a receiving society. Well, by the 20th century, the late 20th century and into the 21st century, it's now a sending society. And we want to think about that again in terms of, all of the politics of the Trump, or even we can go back even before that, right? Administrations, building a wall because of this, hordes of those coming from Mexico and South America, and we need to keep them out, and all of those other kinds of things, right? The migrant issues. So this is driving political, social, economic issues around the world. Okay. and again into the 2000s. And again, look at even the numbers, like coming from Latin America into North America. But we can see the internal flows within Africa, Asia, and Europe again growing over this period. Okay, there we think about, again, even in terms of European migrations, right, in the modern period, again, largely after 1990 and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. All right, but obviously Eastern Europe has long been, as I noted in a previous lecture, right, the kind of poorer cousin of Europe, and so movement of peoples out of Eastern Europe into Western Europe for jobs, for better societies, for welfare states, for all kinds of things. And you can see this in many ways, the driving of politics in places like France, but also the United Kingdom. And you can think about the idea of Brexit being driven by the fact that there were, quote unquote, too many immigrants in the United Kingdom, in England, and that England was going to kind of take back control, right, for the English and provide for its own population. We know that in the long term probably will be disastrous, but this is what's driving some of those issues. Okay. And so again, the global migrations, the share of population who are immigrants. Now, those kind of white settler dominions, Canada, United States, Australia, still tend to be the magnets, right, for migrants over this period, and quite rightly so. I mean, you're going to go to societies that have economic opportunities that promote social, political, economic freedoms. But increasingly, again, Europe, which had been a sending society, is now a receiving society, right? Since 2000, like I said before, South America, ascending rather than a receiving one. But what's up with those Arab Gulf states, right? The United Arab Emirates or Qatar or Saudi Arabia, 88%. Like, that's ridiculous. So what's going on there? Well, if you're a soccer fan, right, you think about the World Cup that's going on in Qatar that will be hosted in 2022, so next year. A lot of the facilities are being built by migrant workers, many of whom have few, if any rights in those societies. And there's been all kinds of protests that Qatar should not be hosting the 2022 World Cup of Soccer, and that the tremendous misuse of migrant labor, largely coming from places in Southeast Asia, is a reason for that. And so, does this portend potentially new forms of forced or unfree labor in the modern period?